Good evening, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. Well, that's what it's supposed to be called, but since YouTube didn't like that channel very much, now we've got our backup channel, and so I'm still saying the old name, but what we're really at, of course, is MacDuff underscore 2020 underscore 2020. And books, man, this is what we're all about here, especially, in the evening shows, although tomorrow evening is going to be an exception. We're going to have the great Mark Kulak of Housatonic Live will be checking in with me for another of our monthly or so hour-long updates of mutually updating each other, what's Mark been doing, what I've been doing, and we usually have a pretty lively conversation. So tomorrow night at 8 p.m., be sure and be here at McDuff Channel for Mark Kulak Live, and that'll be a great conversation as always. Well, hello to everyone. I see Linda Hull is in love with the whole world, and that's a nice thing to see. Hi, Tyrone and Carol and Corky and David Underdown. Man, you've been publishing so much stuff. I cannot keep up with it. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I love it, and I wish I could understand immediately what all the connections are that you're giving us. But I hope that we can get together and put that stuff together or whatever, because I love your work. You're a great researcher. Hello, Kathy Sue. Kathy Sue, I can't promise you a easy ride tonight. We're taking on some tough material, okay? We're doing it because nobody else does it, and I feel just my conscience tells me we have to talk about this stuff. I just ordered 6 new books, and I got 3 of them in the mail today. The first one is, well, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I actually paid money for this, but I really do want to read it, and it's called COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malleret. And this is, I think I paid $10 or something for it, and I know Klaus needs the money. He is the founder and executive director of the World Economic Forum, and he's the author of The Fourth Industrial Revolution and a lifelong advocate of what he calls stakeholder capitalism. Well, in my view, he's the enemy of the sovereignty of the United States of America, and that means he's the enemy of me. So I put this under opposition research, and the budget, I have to see what they're thinking. But I've been flipping through it since I got it, and there's just so many crazy things in here. Oh well, I'll wait till I read it. The second book I got is all about Henry the K. Kissinger, None Dare Call It Treason, Book 8, by Robert W. Pelton. Henry Kissinger, the shadowy, untouchable Kremlin spy. Kremlin spy. Henry Kissinger. Remember in David Wise's book where he said about Angleton, he said Angleton interviewed a whistleblower of some kind and said that there was a Kremlin spy whose name began with the letter K. And so Angleton came up with this other guy whose name began with the letter K and persecuted the heck out of him. But it wasn't him. Well, we've been studying the Golonovsky materials, and we find a book. I can't remember the author's name. I'll get it to you. But the idea is that there have been people throughout, my lifetime that have been hip to understanding what the problem is. The problem is that we have a leak, and its name begins with a K. And so Goluniowski, according to this other author, identified Henry Kissinger personally as being a spy for the Soviets. So I think that's a big deal, and I'm going to follow through that by reading this little book by Robert Pelton. And the third one I got, which I've just got it today, so I'm excited about it. Remember Paul L. Williams, the author of Operation Gladio, that revealed so much about the combination of CIA, Vatican Bank, and Mafia that financed Operation Gladio. Well, he's written another book. This one, a co-author Rodney Howard-Browne with Paul L. Williams. The Killing of Uncle Sam, it's called. The Killing of Uncle Sam. And it's all about these people we've been learning about, from Andrew Carnegie, Lord Rothschild, J.P. Morgan. These people do not have the best interest of the United States at heart. In fact, it goes along with so much of what I've read about the Treaty of Verona and the Jesuit order actually taking on from the Metternichs and the nobility of those powerful nations the task of destroying the United States. So, and I've read some books from contemporary writing about how, Abraham Lincoln had some nasty run-ins with the Jesuits, and start to speculate, well, maybe our history books have been a cover story all along. Anyway, that is the third one, The Killing of Uncle Sam by Paul L. Williams and Rodney Howard-Browne. They are trying to kill us, and I think this book is going to be a great key to understanding how we can stop them. Pardon me. Let's get back to Edwin Black's book here. It's called The War Against the Weak, and we've been reading the first chapter where he documents the sweeps of the Virginia Appalachian people to just grab up people that are not particularly well educated and say that they're mentally defective and take them to Western State Hospital in Stanton, Virginia for a sterilization that they don't even know is going on because they haven't been told or they're too young to understand it. And this is a way to get people off of those mountains where people might want to be doing some resource extraction. We do know that that's where the stuff is. It's in the mountains, right? Whether it's the coal or a vein of gold. One doesn't dig in the desert. One digs in the mountains. So to try to get a handle on what's been going on in the world, I've found these books that are just terrifically helpful. And this follows up The Guarded Gate, which I read about 5 months ago. How the elites developed this idea that, heredity is so important, and how they then decided that their own heredity was the most important heredity, and that the less important lines of humanity, like a bad line of, sheep or something. Should I just be culled and let to die or killed? And then we end up, from that intellectual nonsense, financing an Adolf Hitler. So now, chapter 3, we turn to America, and we've been in the development of these theories with Galton, Spencer, and Malthus, and those are Brits. They are acting consistently with most of them employed by or through the British East India Company, which of course is the great transportation means to get the opium from India to China to trade it for silver, so the British have enough silver to buy their tea. That's what they say. Anyway, America, now, chapter 3 of The War Against the Weak. America was ready for eugenics before eugenics was ready for America. What in England was the biology of class, in America became the biology of racial and ethnic groups. In America, class was, in large measure, racial and ethnic. Everything Galtonian eugenics hoped to accomplish with good matrimonial choices, American eugenicists preferred to achieve with draconian preventive measures designed to delete millions of potential citizens deemed unfit. American eugenicists were convinced they could forcibly reshape humanity in their own image. Their outlook was only possible because American eugenicists believed the unfit were essentially subhuman, not worthy of developing as members of society. The unfit were diseased, something akin to a genetic infection. That infection was to be quarantined and then eliminated. Isn't that a creepy thing to read in these times? Their method of choice was selective breeding, spaying and cutting away the undesirable, while carefully mating and grooming the prized stock. Breeding was in America's blood. America had been breeding humans even before the nation's inception. Slavery thrived on human breeding. Only the hardiest Africans could endure the cruel Middle Passage to North America. Once offloaded, the surviving Africans were paraded atop auction stages for inspection of their physical traits. Notions of breeding society into betterment were never far from post-Civil War American thought. In 1865, 2 decades before Galton penned the word eugenics, the utopian Oneida community in upstate New York declared in its newspaper that, quote, human breeding should be one of the foremost questions of the age. A few years later, with freshly expounded Galtonian notions crossing the Atlantic, the Oneida community began its first selective human breeding experiment with 53 female and 38 male volunteers. All right. Would you volunteer? Oh, man. So, feminist author Victoria Woodhull expressed the growing belief that both positive and negative breeding were indispensable for social improvement. In her 1891 pamphlet, The Rapid Multiplication of the Unfit, Woodhull insisted, quote, the best minds of today have accepted the fact that if superior people are desired, they must be bred, and if imbeciles, criminals, paupers, and the otherwise unfit are undesirable citizens, they must not be bred. America was ready for eugenic breeding precisely because the most established echelons of American society were frightened by the demographic chaos sweeping the nation. England had certainly witnessed a mass influx of foreigners during the years leading up to Galton's eugenic doctrine, but the scale in Britain was dwarfed by America's experience. So were the emotions. America's romantic, quote, melting pot notion was a myth. It did not exist when turn-of-the-century British playwright Israel Zangwill optimistically coined the term. In Zangwill's day, America's shores, as well as the 3,000 miles in between, were actually a cauldron of undissolvable minorities, ethnicities, indigenous peoples, and other tightly knit groups, all constantly boiling over. 18 million refugees and opportunity-seeking immigrants arrived between 1890 and 1920. German Lutherans, Irish Catholics, Russian Jews, Slavic Orthodox. One huddled mass surged in after another, but they did not mix or melt. For the most part, they remained insoluble. But the ethnic volatility during the late 1800s arose from more than the European influx. Race and group hatred crisscrossed the continent. Millions of Native Americans were being forced into reservations. Mexican multitudes absorbed after the Mexican-American War, in which Mexico lost fully half its land to the United States expansion, became a clash point in the enlarged American West and Southwest. Emancipated African slaves struggled to emerge across the country. But freed slaves and the next generation were not absorbed into greater society. Instead, a network of state and local Jim Crow laws enforced apartheid between African Americans and whites in much of the nation, especially in the South. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 temporarily halted the immigration through California of any further Chinese laborers, and blocked the naturalization of those already in the country. The measure was made permanent in 1902. Quote, race suicide was an alarm commonly invoked to restrict European immigration. In 1880, as 1880 Census Bureau Director Francis Walker did in his 1896 Atlantic Monthly article, Restriction of Immigration. Walker lamented the statistical imbalance between America's traditional Anglo-Saxon settlers and the new waves flowing in from Southern Europe. Eminent sociologist F.A. Ross elevated the avoidance of race suicide to a patriotic admonishment decrying, quote, the beaten members of beaten breeds from Croatia, Sicily, and Armenia, flooding in through Ellis Island. Ross warned that such groups, quote, lack the ancestral foundations of American character, and even if they catch step up with us, they and their children will nevertheless impede our progress. Pardon me. Yeah, that's better. As the 19th century closed, women could still not vote. Native Americans who had survived governmental genocide programs were locked onto often barren reservations, and blacks, as well as despised, quote, white trash, were still commonly lynched from the nearest tree, from Minnesota to Mississippi. In fact, 3,224 Americans were lynched In the 30-year period between 1889 and 1918, 702 white and 2,522 black. Their crimes were as trivial as uttering offensive language, disobeying ferry regulations, quote, paying attention to a white girl, and distilling illicit alcohol. The century ahead was advertised as an epoch for social progress, but the ushers of that progress would be men and women forged from the racial and cultural fires of prior decades. Many 20th century activists were repelled by the iniquities and lasting scars of racial and social injustice. They were determined to transform America into an egalitarian republic, but others, especially American eugenicists, switched on the lights of the new century, looked around at the teeming dissimilar masses, and collectively declared they had unfinished business. Crime analysis moved race and ethnic hatred into the realm of heredity. Throughout the latter 1800s, crime was increasingly viewed as a group phenomenon and indeed an inherited family trait. Criminologists and social scientists widely believed in the recently identified criminal type, typified by beady eyes and certain phrenological shapes. The notion of a born criminal became popularized. Ironically, when robber barons stole and cheated their way into great wealth, they were lionized as noble leaders of the day, celebrated with namesake foundations and honed by leather-bound genealogies often adorned with coats of arms. It was the petty criminals, not the gilded ones, whom polite society perceived as the great genetic menace. And isn't that still the case today? Petty criminals and social outcasts were abundant in Ulster County, New York. Little did these seemingly inconsequential people know they were making history. In the first decades of the 19th century, this rustic Catskill Mountain region became a popular refuge for urban dropouts who preferred to live off the land in pastoral isolation. Fish and game were abundant. The lifestyle was lazy. Civilization was yonder. But as wealthy New Yorkers followed the Hudson River traffic north, planting opulent Victorian mansions and weekend pleasure centers along its banks, the very urbanization that Ulster's upland recluses spurned caught up to them. Pushed from the traditional fishing shores and hillside hunting grounds, where they lived in shanties, the isolated, unkempt rural folk of Ulster now became, quote, misfits. Not a few of them ran afoul of property and behavior laws and became increasingly important as the county's population grew. The laws became more important, that is. Many found themselves jailed for the very lifestyle that had become a local tradition. In 1874, Richard Dugdale, an executive of the New York Prison Association, conducted interviews with a number of Ulster County's prisoners and discovered that many were blood relatives. Consulting genealogies, courthouse, and poorhouse records, Dugdale documented the lineages of no fewer than 42 families, heavily comprised of criminals, beggars, vagrants, and paupers. He claimed that one group of 709 individuals were all descendants of a single pauper woman known as Margaret, and crowned, quote, the mother of criminals. Dugdale collectively dubbed these 42 troubled families, quote, the Jukes. His 1877 book, The Jukes, a study in crime, pauperism, disease, and heredity, calculated that escalating annual costs to society for welfare, imprisonment, and other social services for each family, the text immediately exerted a vast influence on social scientists across America and around the world. While Dugdale's book spared no opportunity to disparage the human qualities of both the simple paupers and the accomplished criminals among the Jukes family, he blamed not their biology but their circumstances. Rejecting notions of heredity, Dugdale instead zeroed in on the adverse conditions that created generation-to-generation pauperism and criminality. Quote, "The tendency of heredity is to produce an environment which perpetuates that heredity," he wrote. He called for a change in social environment to correct the problem, and predicted that serious reform could effect a, quote, "great decrease in the number of commitments within 15 years. Dugdale cautioned against statistics that inspired false conclusions. He even reminded readers that not a few wealthy clans made their forenames by cheating the masses, made their fortunes by cheating the masses. Yet these scandalous people were considered among the nation's finest families. But Dugdale's cautions were ignored. His book was quickly hailed as proof of a hereditary defect that spawned excessive criminality and poverty, even though this was the opposite of what he wrote. For example, Robert Fletcher, president of the Anthropological Society of Washington, insisted in a major 1891 speech that germplasm ruled and that one criminal bred another. "The taint is in the blood," Fletcher staunchly told his audience, "and there is no royal touch which can expel it. Quarantine the evil classes as you would the plague." Pardon me. Quarantine the evil masses as you would the plague. The Jukes was the first such book, but not the last. Tribes of paupers, criminals, and misfits were tracked and traced in similar books. The Smoky Pilgrims of Kansas, the Jackson Whites of New Jersey, the Hill Folk of Massachusetts, and the Nam family of upstate New York were all portrayed as clans of defective, worthless people, a burden to society, and a hereditary scourge blocking American progress. Most convincing was a presentation made in 1888 to the 15th National Conference of Charities and Correction by the social reformer Reverend Oscar McCulloch. McCulloch, a Congregationalist minister from Indianapolis, presented a paper entitled "The Tribe of Ishmael, a Study of Social Degeneration." The widely reported speech described whole nomadic pauper families dwelling in Indianapolis, all related to a distant forefather from the 1790s. Ishmael's descendants were in fact bands of roving petty thieves and con artists who had victimized town and countryside, giving McCulloch plenty of grist for his attack on their heredity. He compared the Ishmael people to the Saculina parasites that feed off crustaceans. Paupers were inherently of no value to the world, he argued, and would only beget succeeding generations of paupers. And all, quote, because some remote ancestor left its independent, self-helpful life and began a parasitic or pauper life. His research, McCulloch assured, resembles the study of Dr. Dugdale into the Jukes and was suggested by that. Many leading social progressives devoted to charity and reform now saw crime and poverty as inherited defects that needed to be halted for society's sake. When this idea was combined with the widespread racism, class prejudice, and ethnic hatred that already existed among the turn-of-the-century intelligentsia, and was then juxtaposed with the economic costs to society, it created a fertile reception for the infant field of eugenics. Reformers possessed an ingrained sense that good Americans could be bred like good racehorses. Galton had first pronounced his theory of the well-born in 1883. For the next 20 years, eugenics bounced around America's intellectual circles as a perfectly logical, hereditary conclusion, consistent with everyday observations. But it lacked specifics. Then, as one of the first sparks of the 20th century, Gregor Mendel's theory of heredity was rediscovered. True, between 1863 and 1868, various theories of heredity had been published by three men, Spencer, Darwin, and Mendel. But while Darwin and Spencer presided with great fanfare in London's epicenter of knowledge, Mendel was alone and overlooked by the world of science he aspired to. The son of simple mountain peasants, Mendel was not socially adept. Combative exchanges with those in authority made him prefer solitude. Quote, "He who does not know how to be alone is not at peace with himself," he wrote. Originally, he had hoped to devote himself to the natural sciences, but he failed at the university and retreated to an Augustinian monastery in Brno, Moravia. There, while tending the gardens, he continued to the work of a long line of students of plant hybridizations. Mendel preferred peas. Peering through flimsy wire rim glasses into short tubular microscopes and scribbling copious notes, Mendel studied over 10,000 cross-fertilized pea plants. Key differences in their traits could be predicted depending upon whether he bred tall plants with short plants or plants yielding smooth pods with plants yielding wrinkled pods. Eventually, he identified certain governing inheritable traits, which he called dominating and recessive. These could be expressed in mathematical equations or traced to a simple genealogical chart filled with line-linked A's and B's. Among his many conclusions, when pea plants with wrinkled skins were crossed with plants yielding smooth skins, the trait for wrinkled skin dominated. In other words, the smooth pea pod skin was corrupted by wrinkled stock. Wrinkled pea pods ultimately became a powerful image to those who found the human smile, the human simile, compelling. Mendel's scientific paper describing 10 years of tedious work was presented to a local society in Brno and mailed to several prominent biologists in Europe, but it was ignored by the scientific world. Mendel grew more unhappy with the rejection. His combative exchanges with local officials on unrelated issues were so embarrassing to the order that when Mendel died in 1884, the monastery burned all his notes. In May of 1900, however, the esteemed British naturalist and Darwin disciple William Bateson unexpectedly discovered references to Mendel's laws of heredity in 3 separate papers. The 3 papers were independently researched and simultaneously submitted by 3 different students. Amazed at Mendel's findings, an excited Bateson announced to the world through the Royal Horticultural Society that he had, quote, rediscovered Mendel's crucial studies in plant heredity. The science that Bateson called genetics was born. Mendel's laws became widely discussed throughout the horticultural world. But Galton's eugenics followers understood that the biological arithmetic of pea pods, cattle, and other lower species did not ordain the futures of the most complex organism on earth, Homo sapiens. Height, hair color, eye color, and other physical attributes could be partially explained in Mendelian terms, but intelligent, thought-driven human beings were too subtle, too impressionable, too variable, and too unpredictable to be reduced to horticultural equations. Man's environment and living conditions were inherent to his development. Nutrition, prenatal and childhood circumstances, disease, injury, and upbringing itself were all decisive, albeit not completely understood, factors that intervened in the development of any individual. Some of the best people came from the worst homes, and some of the worst people came from the best homes. Hence, during the first decade of the 20th century, as Mendel was being debated, most Galtonian eugenicists admitted that their ideas were still too scantily clad to be called science, too steeped in simple statistics rather than astute medical knowledge, too preliminary to even venture into the far-reaching enterprise of organized human breeding. Eugenics was all just theory and guesswork anyway. For example, in 1904, Galton wrote to his colleague Bateson, seeking any initial evidence of, quote, Mendelianism in man, suggesting that any data could contribute to what he still called a theoretical point of view. In another letter, Galton reminded Bateson, I do indeed fervently hope that exact knowledge may be gradually attained and established beyond question, and I wish you and your collaborators all success in your attempts to obtain it. As late as 1910, Galton's most important disciple, mathematician Karl Pearson, head of the eugenics laboratory, admitted just how thin their knowledge was. In a scientific paper treating eugenics and alcoholism, Pearson confessed, the writers of this paper are fully conscious of the slenderness of their data. They have themselves stated that many of their conclusions are probabilities rather than demonstrations. They will no doubt be upbraided with publishing anything at all, either on the ground that what they are dealing with is crude and worthless material, or that as a mathematical outsiders they are incapable of dealing with a medico-social problem. Pearson added in a footnote that he also understood why some would find the linkage of eugenics and alcoholism an act of inebriation in itself. He went on to quote a critic, quote, the educated man and the scientist is as prone as any other to become the victim of his prejudices. He will, in defense thereof, make shipwreck of both the facts of science and the methods of science, by perpetrating every form of fallacy, inaccuracy, and distortion, unquote. Galton himself dismissed the whole notion of human breeding as socially impossible, with or without the elusive data that he craved. We can't mate men and women as we please, like cocks and hens, Galton quipped to Bateson. At the time, Galton was defending his recently published Index to Achievements of Near Kinfolk, which detailed how talent and skill run in the same celebrated families. Wary of being viewed as an advocate of human breeding, Galton's preface cautioned Mendelian devotees with strong conditionals, such as ifs and buts. The experience gained in establishing improved breeds of domestic animals and plants, he wrote, is a safe guide to speculations on the theoretical possibility of establishing improved breeds of the human race. It is not intended to enter here into such speculations, but to emphasize the undoubted fact that members of gifted families are more likely to produce gifted offsprings. Nor did Galton believe regulated marriages were a realistic proposition in any democratic society. He knew that human nature would never brook interference with the freedom of marriage, and admitted as much publicly. In his published memoir, he recounted his original error in suggesting such utopian marriages. I was too much disposed to think of marriage under some regulation, he conceded, and not enough of the effects of self-interest and of social and religious sentiment. Unable to achieve a level of scientific certainty needed to create a legal eugenic framework in Britain, Galton hoped to recast eugenics as a religious doctrine governing marriages, a creed to be taken on faith without proof. Indeed, faith without proof constitutes the essence of much religious dogma. Eugenical marriage should be, quote, strictly enforced as a religious duty, as the Levirate law ever was, wrote Galton, which listed such precedents in Jewish, Christian, and even some primitive traditions. Many of Galton's followers agreed that founding a national religion was the only way eugenics could thrive. Even as the playwright George Bernard Shaw, a eugenics extremist, agreed in a 1903 essay that nothing but a eugenic religion can save our civilization, unquote. Later in his life, in 1909, Galton declared that eugenics in a civilized nation would succeed only as, quote, one of its religious tenets. But in America, it did not matter that Galton and his followers found themselves fighting for intellectual acceptance with little evidence on their side. Nor did it matter that the British eugenics leaders themselves admitted that eugenics did not rise to the level of scientific certainty sufficient to formulate public policy. Nor did it matter that Mendel's newly celebrated laws of heredity might make good sense for pea pods, but not for thinking, feeling men, women, and children. In America, racial activists had already convinced themselves that those of different races and ethnic backgrounds considered inferior were no more than a hereditary blight in need of eugenic cleansing. Many noted reformers even joined the choir. For example, in a 1909 article called Practical Eugenics, the early 20th century education pioneer John Franklin Bobbitt insisted, quote, in primal days was the blood of the race kept high and pure like mountain streams, unquote. He now cautioned that the highest, purest tributaries to the stream of heredity were being supplanted by a rising flood in the muddy, undesirable streams. Bobbitt held out little value for the offspring of worm-eaten stock, although considered a social progressive. He argued that the laws of nature mandating survival of the fittest were constantly being countermanded by charitable endeavors. Schools and charities, he harangued, supply crutches to the weak in mind and morals, and corrupt the streams of heredity. Society, he pleaded, must prevent the weaklings at the bottom from mingling their weakness in human currents. Defective humans were not just those carrying obvious diseases or handicaps, but those whose lineages strayed from the Germanic, Nordic, and/or white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideal. Bobbitt made clear that only those descended from Teutonic forefathers were of pure blood. In one such remonstration he reminded, quote, one must admit the high purity of their blood, their high average sanity, soundness, and strength. They were a well-born, well-weeded race. Eugenics spokesman Madison Grant, trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, stated the belief simply in his popular book, quote, The Passing of the Great Race, writing that Nordics, quote, were the white man par excellence. Indeed, the racism of America's first eugenic intellectuals was more than just a movement of whites against non-whites. They believed that Germans and Nordics comprised the supreme race, and a typical lament among eugenic leaders such as Lothrop Stoddard was that Nordic populations were decreasing. In The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, Stoddard wrote that the Industrial Revolution had attracted squalid Mediterranean peoples who quickly outnumbered the more desirable Nordics. In the United States, it has been much the same story. Our country, originally settled almost exclusively by Nordics, was, toward the close of the 19th century, invaded by hordes of immigrant Alpines and Mediterraneans, not to mention Asiatic elements like Levantines and Jews. As a result, the Nordic Native Americans have been crowded out with amazing rapidity by these swarming, prolific aliens. And after 2 short generations, he has, in many of our urban areas, become almost extinct. Madison Grant agreed, quote, "The term Caucasian race has ceased to have any meaning." By no means did the eugenics movement limit its animus to non-English speaking immigrants. It was a movement against non-Nordics, regardless of their skin color, language, or national origin. For example, Stoddard denigrated the, quote, swart Cockney in Britain as a resurgence of the primitive Mediterranean stock and probably a faithful replica of his ancestors of Neolithic times. All mixed breeds were vile. Where the parent stocks are very diverse, wrote Stoddard, as in matings between whites, Negroes, and Amerindians, the offspring is a mongrel, a walking chaos, so consumed by his jarring heredities that he is quite worthless. Grant's tome lionized the long-headed skulls, blue eyes, and blond hair of true Nordic stock, and outlined the complex history of Nordic migrations and invasions across Eurasia and into Great Britain. Eventually, these Nordic settlements were supplanted by lesser breeds, who adopted the Nordic and Anglo-Saxon languages, but were in fact the carriers of corrupt human strains. Indeed, these Americans, descended from lower-class Scottish and Irish families, were also viewed as a biological menace. Being of Mediterranean descent, brunette hair constituted an ancestral stigma that proved a non-Nordic bloodline. Any claims by such people to Anglo-Saxon descent because of a language or nationality were considered fraudulent. Grant railed, quote, "No one can question on the streets of London the contrast between the Piccadilly gentleman of Nordic race and the Cockney costermonger, that meaning street vendor, of the Neolithic type. Hence, from Ulster County to the Irish slums of Manhattan, to the Kentucky and Virginia hills, poor whites were reviled by eugenicists, not for their ramshackle and destitute lifestyles, but for a heredity that supposedly made pauperism and criminality as an inevitable genetic trait. Well, I'm not going to make it through this chapter tonight, so I think I'll put a lid on it tonight, as one of our presidential candidates is wont to say. This material that I'm reading is so important to me because it explains things like how could they do things to a guy like my dad, and it's just because he wasn't Nordic. He was Celtic. He was, from one of those lesser races. And even though they gave him a great education and opportunities in life, when he didn't follow their path, he didn't do what they had prescribed for him to do, they had consequences for him. And that idea of being a servitor, in Professor Hamamoto's great words, that idea of being a servitor never sits right with free people. And I don't think it ever will. All right, everybody. I am a little bit tired tonight, so I'm going to say goodnight. We'll see you tomorrow. I will be with you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. with the great Mark Kulak. So look forward to seeing you all then. Good night.